Martinez positioned himself with recording equipment in the adjacent building while I waited in the main storage area. Every sense alert for the slightest sign that our plan was going wrong. Rick was supposed to lead Darla into the trap by making her believe everything was going according to her plan. But his amateur acting skills weren't prepared for the pressure of the moment. Remember, Martinez had told Rick during our briefing, she needs to say something incriminating about the kidnapping and the money. Get her talking about why she had to take drastic measures, how much money is at stake. Anything that shows this was all planned and premeditated. Rick nodded nervously, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. I can do this. I owe it to your daughter and all the other families she's hurt. As we waited in the darkness of the storage building, I felt the familiar pre-mission calm that used to settle over me before dangerous operations. Everything depended on the next few hours, and failure wasn't an option when my daughter's future hung in the balance. Darla arrived exactly when Rick said she would, driving her silver BMW and looking around nervously as she parked near the building entrance. I could hear her heels clicking on the concrete as she approached, each step echoing in the empty facility like a countdown to justice. "Rick," she called out, her voice carrying a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "Where are you? Where's the girl?" Rick emerged from the shadows, playing his role, but clearly struggling with the deception. "She's in the back office, Mrs. Patterson, tied up and quiet, just like you wanted." I watched from my concealed position as Darla's face showed relief, mixed with something that might have been guilt or satisfaction. "Good," she said, her voice cold and calculating. "This should be enough to make her father see reason. When he realizes we have his precious daughter, he'll drop all the charges and move away quietly like the others did." Rick hesitated, shifting his weight nervously as he tried to follow the script we'd rehearsed. "You promised this was the last one, Darla," he said, his voice carrying genuine uncertainty. She sneered at his obvious discomfort. "It is the last one. After this, he'll vanish like the rest of them. You'll get your plea deal, and this will all be behind us." Rick pressed further, seeking the kind of detailed confession that would seal her fate. "And the kid, she won't be harmed." Darla's silence lasted too long, and I could see Rick flinch at the implications of what she might be considering. I said, "Do your job," she snapped, clearly irritated by his questions. But Rick was beginning to crack under the pressure. I could see that our carefully planned operation was starting to unravel. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to know this is worth the risk. If we get caught with a kidnapped child, we're looking at federal time." Darla's eyes flashed with anger and something darker. Risk. "Rick, we've collected over $400,000 from this community over the past 3 years. Do you think I'm going to let one stubborn military brat destroy everything I've built?" That's when things went wrong in the way that combat operations sometimes do, suddenly and completely. Instead of continuing with the planned conversation that would have given us everything we needed for a conviction, Darla suddenly became suspicious of Rick's behavior and the questions he was asking. "Rick," she said, her voice changing from irritated to dangerous, "why aren't you showing me the girl? Why are we standing here talking when she could be trying to escape?" Rick's amateur acting skills weren't enough to maintain the deception under pressure from someone who had spent years manipulating and controlling people. She's secure, Mrs. Patterson. I just wanted to make sure we had our story straight before Darla stepped closer to Rick, studying his face in the dim light with the predatory focus of someone who had survived by reading people's weaknesses. "You didn't do it, did you?" she said quietly, her voice carrying a deadly certainty. "You didn't actually take the girl. This is some kind of setup." Before Rick could respond or I could intervene, she reached into her purse, not for documents, something small, metallic. Her knuckles whitened. Rick stepped back. I moved. The standoff that followed lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours as I watched Darla Patterson struggle with the reality that her criminal empire was finally collapsing around her. She kept the weapon pointed in Rick's general direction, while pacing back and forth like a caged animal, muttering about community standards and ungrateful residents who didn't appreciate her sacrifices. "You people have no idea what I've had to do to keep this community from falling apart," she said, her voice becoming increasingly unhinged. This operation was perfect until you started making mistakes. I realized the situation was deteriorating. Rapidly, I made the decision to intervene before someone got killed. Mrs. Patterson, he said, stepping out of the shadows with my hands visible. I think we need to talk. The sound of police sirens in the distance was like music to my ears, and I could see Darla's face changing as she realized that her time was running out and her options had disappeared. The emergency HOA meeting that night was unlike anything Oak Ridge had ever witnessed. Word of Darla's arrest had spread like wildfire, carried by whispers, texts, and stunned neighbors who'd seen police cars outside the old HOA storage facility. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was full, and residents were spilling out onto the sidewalk. The community center, once a place of pancake breakfasts and low-stakes bingo, now buzzed like a courtroom before a high-profile verdict. People weren't just curious. They were angry, betrayed, ready for answers. Inside, the air crackled with tension. Folding chairs had been pulled out of storage and set in tight rows, but even that wasn't enough. People stood shoulder to shoulder, packed against the walls. Some craned their necks from the hallway. Every face looked drawn, tired, suspicious. For years, they'd trusted Darla Patterson to lead their community. For years, they'd written checks, paid fines, followed arbitrary rules, and now they were about to find out where all of that had really gone. Martinez stood near the front, projecting calm through a storm of resentment. His laptop was hooked to a projector, casting slides onto a large screen behind him. Financial statements, violation letters, confidential HOA documents now made public, a war room in slideshow form. He didn't start right away. First, Rick Thompson stood, visibly shaken, still wearing the clothes from earlier that day. Rick looked like a man who had spent the last few hours replaying his sins in his head. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the microphone. The crowd hushed as he cleared his throat. I want everyone here to know that I'm deeply ashamed of what I've done. Silence. Mrs. Patterson told me I was helping protect this community, he continued, voice wavering. But what I was really doing was helping her steal your money and terrorize your families. A collective breath was drawn and held. He described everything. The fake security patrols, intimidation scripts, the selective enforcement of HOA rules, Darla's meticulous profiles, who was elderly, who lived alone, who'd recently deployed. Residents had known something was wrong. They'd just never guessed how orchestrated it all was. Then Martinez took the floor. He didn't use scare tactics or dramatic language. He didn't need to. The facts spoke louder than any flourish. What we've uncovered, he said, pacing slowly in front of the crowd, is not just a case of overzealous HOA management. This is systematic fraud and embezzlement that's been going on for over 3 years. Slides changed, names appeared, bank accounts, fake invoices, compliance fees that went straight to Darla's private accounts. She created a fictitious compliance committee, he explained, one that doesn't exist in the HOA bylaws. Then she used it to send out letters citing violations, impose fines, and threaten liens. None of it was real, but it was terrifying enough. To make good people comply, murmurs began to rise. A woman in the back yelled, "That's my money." A man stood up, face red, fists clenched. Another sobbed quietly, shaking their head. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning, Martinez continued, showing how Darla had rigged votes, removed board members, and used Rick to enforce her will. But the real shock came next. She wasn't done, he said, his tone darkening. She had plans to expand this operation to 3 other communities in the region. Gasps. He clicked to a new slide mails between Darla and HOA management firms in neighboring developments. She was coaching them, teaching them how to create fake enforcement boards, write intimidating letters, and bleed residents dry under the pretense of community standards. Your community, Martinez said, was the testing ground for a much larger criminal operation. Oak Ridge was supposed to be the blueprint. More whispers, anger rising like a wave. Rick stepped forward again to explain how he'd been used, how Darla had drilled into him the importance of gathering psychological intel, what kind of person lived in each house, what they feared, what made them cave. She told me, Rick said, that the key to control was isolation. Make each person feel like they were the only ones struggling. Like everyone else was fine, and they were the problem. People in the crowd began to nod, murmured affirmations, quiet curses. Then the residents started speaking. Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor, stood up. She held her cane in one hand and trembled with the weight of what she was about to share. I paid over $2,000 in special assessments the last 2 years, she said. I couldn't afford it. I skipped my prescriptions. But I thought if I didn't pay, they'd take my house. Someone cried out. They said the same thing to me, another resident. They threatened to sue me over flower colors. One after another, people stood, shared, confirmed. The stories were different, but the method was always the same: confusion. Intimidation and threats wrapped in official language that sounded just real enough to obey. The weight of the room shifted. From silence to solidarity. Martinez wrapped it up with a vote. Complete overhaul of the HOA board. Every old member who hadn't resigned was formally removed. A new board was elected on the spot with community approval. The crowd didn't just want reform, they wanted accountability. Resolutions passed unanimously. Mandatory financial audits every quarter, term limits for all board members, transparency. Measures for any enforcement action, immediate review, and refund process. For all fines and assessments collected in the last 3 years, the vote was recorded. Applause erupted. Justice was underway. As people filed out, they didn't just shake hands or nod politely. They hugged. They talked. For the first time in years, neighbors became neighbors again. Some thanked Rick, some thanked Martinez, and some came to me, one man said. We needed someone like you. But it was Mrs. Henderson's words that stuck. She took my hand in both of hers and whispered, "You didn't just save Leah, you gave this place back to us." That night I walked through the neighborhood like it was unfamiliar terrain. Lawns, porches, fences. They all looked the same, but something fundamental had changed. This wasn't Darla's HOA anymore. This was Oak Ridge, a real community. Again, 3 months later. Darla Patterson was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for mail fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Her lawyers tried to argue diminished responsibility, but the recordings, especially her own words about making the military brat disappear, were impossible to explain away. Rick Thompson, now fully cooperating, was given 2 years of probation. His testimony, combined with the evidence Martinez had assembled, was instrumental in securing Darla's conviction. The class action suit Martinez filed recovered nearly $600,000, including penalties and interest. That money was returned to the residents who'd been fined, assessed, or manipulated out of their hard-earned savings. And perhaps most importantly, Oak Ridge became what it was always meant to be: a peaceful place to raise families, not a suburban battleground ruled by power-hungry tyrants in pastel cardigans. The new HOA board held its first town hall just 2 weeks after the vote. The agenda: reviewing landscaping rules and planning a community barbecue. No fines, no citations. Just food, laughter, and second chances. And the orange basketball hoop. Still standing, still bright, still bold, still a symbol of what happens when good people finally stand up. Leah and I shoot hoops under it every Saturday. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with other kids from the neighborhood. She's got a killer jump shot now. And every time that ball arcs through the air and hits nothing but net, I think about how close we came to losing everything and how we fought back. Not with violence, not with threats, but with truth and fire, and the kind of resolve that can't be broken. This isn't just about an HOA. It's about justice. And sometimes justice shows up with a lawyer, a clipboard, and a dad who refuses to surrender. 3 months after that unforgettable night at the community center, life in Oak Ridge had changed in ways that were both profound and beautifully subtle. Gone were the fear and suspicion that once hung over the neighborhood, like storm clouds. The angry letters in red ink, the unannounced inspections, the sense that someone was always watching and judging. Those things had evaporated like fog in the morning sun, placed by cookouts, kids on bikes, and something Oak Ridge hadn't seen in a long time: neighbors talking to each other. People began to reclaim their homes, not just physically, but emotionally. Flags returned to porches. Garden beds blossomed again, unafraid of unauthorized color palettes. The fence paint colors became a badge of individuality instead of a violation. Families who had once kept to themselves came out for block parties, impromptu driveway chats, and Saturday night movie screenings projected onto garage doors. It wasn't perfect, no community ever is, but it was real, honest, alive. The new HOA board, composed entirely of volunteers with no political ambitions and no desire to control anyone, met weekly in the rec center. Every meeting was open door. Every dollar spent was documented and posted online. They weren't trying to rule the neighborhood. They were just trying to keep the lawns mowed, the pool clean, and the roads pothole-free. And somehow, shockingly, to those who'd lived under Darla's grip, the neighborhood still looked great. The streets remained clean. Property values held. The kids respected curfew. All without fear, fines, or surveillance, it turned out. People didn't need to be bullied to care about their community. They just needed to be treated like people. As for the legal aftermath, justice, when it came, was swift and thorough. Darla Patterson had built an empire of fraud, but she never saw herself as a criminal. Even after her conviction, she spoke in court as though she were the victim of some elaborate misunderstanding. Her tone was indignant, her apologies hollow. Was trying to protect the community, she said, voice trembling, from the kind of chaos that happens when no one enforces the rules. But the evidence had spoken, her own voice, recorded clearly on Martinez's equipment, admitting to the extortion, the fabricated violations, and the plan to make him disappear like the others. The jury took less than 2 hours to return. A unanimous guilty verdict. For years in federal prison, no parole. Rick Thompson's fate was different. Like Darla, he expressed genuine remorse. In court, he cried not in the performative crocodile tear kind of way, but with the quiet, haunted grief of a man who finally understood what he had been part of. He told the judge, "I thought I was helping. I really believed her at first. But when I saw what she was doing to that little girl, what she was willing to do, I knew I had to stop it, even if it meant turning myself in." The court showed leniency. He received 2 years probation, mandatory community service, and a lifetime ban from holding any HOA position. He moved out of Oak Ridge shortly after the sentencing. Some residents still harbored resentment, but most just felt sorry for him, a man who let fear blind him to what was right. The class action lawsuit, filed by Martinez on behalf of the residents, had been a slow but steady burn in the background. After months of document reviews, depositions, and settlement negotiations, the outcome was a rare victory for the victims. Nearly $600,000 was recovered, including penalties and interest. That money didn't make up for the stress, the fear, the sense of helplessness so many had endured, but it helped. Refund checks arrived in the mail like overdue apologies. Some residents cried, others laughed in disbelief. Mrs. Henderson framed. "Hers? I'm not even cashing it," she said proudly. "I want to remember that we fought back." Leigh and I returned to normal in our own way too. The orange basketball hoop stayed up, still bright, still slightly crooked, still a target of every neighborhood kid with a decent jump shot. Every Saturday, we played. 1-on-1, full court, best of 5. She kept getting better, faster, sharper. I started losing more often than I won. "Getting old, Dad," she'd say, grinning. "You're just cheating with youth," I'd reply. But it wasn't about the games anymore. It was about everything that hoop represented. Resistance, community, resilience. Neighbors began to stop by. Sometimes they shot hoops with us. Sometimes they brought cookies or lawn chairs or stories. One man, a father of 3 who'd once been fined for having unsanctioned play equipment, told me that seeing the hoops still standing gave him hope. "We thought they could take anything," he said. "But you proved they couldn't take everything." And he was right. Because this wasn't just about an HOA. It was about power and what happens when it goes unchecked. It was about fear and what happens when we let it silence us. It was about a father's love, a daughter's safety, a neighborhood's second chance. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of gold and lavender, Sat on the porch and listened. No sirens, no arguments, just birds. Distant laughter, and the rhythmic bounce of a basketball. That's when I realized what had truly changed. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge felt like home. And it wasn't just because Darla was gone. It was because the people had taken it back, inch by inch. Vote by vote. Truth by painful truth. They'd stood together and said, no more. Not here. Not again. Martinez kept working cases. He told me Oak Ridge had become something of a model for HOA reform in the region. Other communities reached out for help. Other residents started asking questions. One even told him, I heard about the basketball hoop case. I guess that's what it had become in some circles. Symbol, a story. A warning, don't mess with people who still believe in right and wrong. Don't underestimate what neighbors can do when they stop whispering and start fighting back. Don't assume that silence means consent, because sometimes all it takes is one spark, one hoop, one daughter, one voice to burn down a fortress of lies. And when that happens, well, that's when justice finally arrives, quietly, relentlessly, and without apology. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest memories. The panic of that night in the storage facility, the chaos of the emergency HOA meeting, the sense of betrayal and loss, all of it, began to settle into something else. Understanding, perspective, peace. Oak Ridge wasn't just healing. It was transforming. 3 months after Darla's sentencing, the new HOA board passed a full reform charter nicknamed the Oak Ridge Bill of Rights. It laid out 10 core principles that no HOA rule or bylaw could ever override: freedom from arbitrary fines, the right to appeal, access to public records, and protections against intimidation. It was posted on every notice board and mailed to every resident. They even held a community signing event where neighbors, old and new, added their names to a ceremonial version framed and mounted in the community center. The man who'd once yelled, "That's my money," at the emergency meeting became the board's treasurer. Former teacher took over as president. Mrs. Henderson, despite her age and arthritis, ran the new welcome committee. She called herself the vibe regulator and made sure new families felt supported, not surveilled. And Martinez. He became something of a local legend after Oak Ridge. He was inundated with requests, emails, phone calls, even handwritten letters. From communities across the state, people who had seen their own HOAs go dark and didn't know where to turn. He never charged for consultations, said justice should never be a business model. In interviews, he always gave credit to the NC residents who refused to be bullied, but off camera, when it was just the two of us sitting in my backyard, he'd shake his head and mutter, "That woman, Darla. She was the tip of a very dirty iceberg." Turns out she wasn't alone. Over the next year, Martinez uncovered 2 more HOA fraud rings. One in a retirement community in Cedar Valley, another in a gated neighborhood on the east side. Both use variations of Darla's tactics: fake fines, intimidation, insider deals. But after Oak Ridge, residents were quicker to speak up, quicker to organize. State lawmakers even introduced a bill named after Leah, the Leah Act, requiring external audits and ombudsman oversight for all HOAs over a certain size. It didn't pass the first year, but people were talking now, asking hard questions, watching. I wasn't involved in those fights directly. I'd done my part. I gave testimony when asked. I consulted a few families who needed help reading legal language or drafting community petitions. But mostly I stayed quiet. I'd gone to war to protect my daughter. Now I just wanted to be her dad. Leah was doing great. She'd become something of a local celebrity herself. Her teachers asked her to speak about courage and civic responsibility at school assemblies. One even suggested she write a book. Too dramatic, she said. Plus, I don't want to be the basketball hoop girl forever. I understood. She wanted a normal life, not a story. But life has a funny way of not staying normal. One morning, I got a letter. No return address. Just a plain white envelope with my name handwritten on the front. Inside was a single photograph. A blurry, grainy image taken from what looked like a home security camera. It showed a woman, middle-aged, sunglasses, dark coat, talking to a man in a suit on a quiet suburban street. Both of them were pointing at a house. There was no note, no context. Just one sentence scribbled on the back in red ink. It's happening. Again, I showed it to Martinez. He studied it for a long time without speaking. Then he folded it in half and slid it into his file. I'll look into it, he said quietly. You stay out of this one. And I did. But I'd never stop thinking about it, because that's the thing about stories like ours. Once you've lived through one, you can't unsee the patterns, the quiet abuses, the smiling threats, the way power wraps itself in rules and procedure and pretends it's just doing its job. Oak Ridge was safe now, but out there, in neighborhoods just like ours, there were still Darla Pattersons, still Rick Thompsons, still families afraid to speak up. That's why I keep telling this story. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but because someone, somewhere, might be staring at a violation notice they know isn't right, might be wondering if they're the only one, might be afraid to fight back to them. I say this, you are not alone. You are not powerless, and you are not crazy. What happened to you is real, and it's wrong. And there are people who will stand with you if you have the courage to stand first. Start small. Ask questions. Talk to your neighbors. Document everything. Know your rights. Find a Martinez if you can. Be your own if you must. But don't stay silent, because silence is what they count on, and your voice. It's the thing they fear most as. For me and Leia, we're still playing basketball, still shooting hoops every Saturday morning, still arguing over fouls and laughing over missed layups. That bright orange rim, it's got dings and scratches and one bent bolt. I keep forgetting to fix, but it's still up, still standing, still a symbol of what we fought for. And every time I hear that ball bounce on concrete, on hope, on history, remember one person can make a difference. One lie can unravel an empire, one girl can spark a revolution, and one orange hoop, it can change everything.